Now, so welcome to our, every other month ICS webinar that we're trying to work through as a series. So today we're going to have Dr. Aric LaBarr share with us about his work with nonprofit organizations, as well as just thinking about how we can use our statistical techniques and our expertise for ministry. So I'm going to let him talk a little bit more about his background, just for everyone's sake, for kind of keeping things organized. Aric and I have talked, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to monitor the chat. So if you have questions that you're thinking about as you're working, as he's talking, please feel free to send those in to me in the chat, and I'll record those and kind of organize them a little bit and keep track of general themes. And when he gets to good points at each section, and he wants to respond to questions, I'll share what's come in so that we can kind of keep that organized and not ask the same question multiple times or at various points. And I'll try to make sure that everyone's questions get answered in the time that we have allotted for us. So at this point, I think I will turn it over to Dr. LaBarr and allow him to share with us his heart for models and ministry.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's a pleasure talking with you all today. It's always fun being able to talk with the people at the ICS. I remember when I was a board member a few years back. It is an absolute pleasure being able to be here. Much like Sam mentioned, I am a PhD in statistics, a faculty member over at Wake Forest University in their School of Business, teaching in their Master of Science in Business Analytics program. But for a number of years now, I have participated as a consultant in the world of ministry. In fact, I even have a sort of side ministry called Data for God that has gotten me plugged in with a lot of different organizations that are out there around using data to be able to help further the kingdom. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to share a little bit about some of the experiences that I've had over the last decade and a half working with these organizations, and some of the big lessons that I've learned along the way, because it's always something where data people have an idea of how to be able to approach executives specifically in ministry, but ministry people also have ideas about data people. So I'm going to try and bring those two audiences together a little bit to sort of see from each other's perspective what is actually going on. So let's jump in a little bit. So the thing that organizations always have as their strong suit is they usually have a good understanding of the goals that they want to accomplish whenever they have a problem. For Christian organizations, these goals typically involve making an impact, right? We would want our Christian organizations to make an impact on people's lives, an impact on people's hearts, an impact on people's souls, but impact nonetheless. The hard part, though, is trying to connect these two concepts. They know who they are, they know what they want to do, but they don't always know how these two things can actually go together. And in fact, at times, these two things can seem far apart, where they have an idea of what they want in terms of a problem, they have an idea of the impact that they want to make. But what I am here to say is that data is the one way to connect these pieces together. In fact, in this talk, I actually am going to talk about three different pieces. I'm going to be talking about the understanding of the problem, the impact, as well as the data. This is all going to be in more detail. And this, again, comes from my experiences of being a consultant for over 10 years now in the Christian nonprofit space, and even longer working for just regular for-profit organizations. So if data is the thing that connects understanding and impact together, let's jump into that first section and talk about understanding. So when it comes to setting up a problem, how do we need to approach it? Well, for each one of these, I've tried to make a corresponding Bible verse that'll go with them to be able to help center us on God's word around this subject. So for this one, I'm going with 1 Corinthians 12:12. The human body has many parts, but the many parts make up one whole body. So it is with the body of Christ. Leaders of organizations, as well as data scientists, statisticians, really have a lot in common. Both of them want to solve problems. Both of them want to create impact. The common ground is the foundation for how we can connect these two groups of people to solve the problems that these organizations have. Leaders understand the problem in the organization at a level that statisticians and data scientists typically don't. However, the data scientists understand the data and how to measure impact in a way that leaders desire to know more about. So we are part of one body. Together, we can solve problems that neither of us, any of us, can solve on our own. So with a lot of these, I'm also going to tell a story. So here's my story for this one. Too often, data scientists are chasing down exciting projects without really understanding what the problem is at hand. The "I've got a solution for you. What was your problem again?" kind of mentality. Being in the world of consulting, I have seen that countless times. Some analysis is easy, but that easy analysis can drive big results. Recently, I was brought into a Christian organization to evaluate a complicated machine learning model that one of their analysts had created. However, that analyst no longer maintained or even handled the model because he moved to a different part of the organization. So he was siloed off somewhere else. So that left behind people managing complicated R code when they didn't know anything about R. So they just ran his script without really knowing what was going on or how it was even useful anymore. I was brought in to understand what was actually going on and whether it was still working. Unfortunately, it wasn't, but no one really knew that. Now, luckily, they had enough guardrails in place at the organization that when it came to decisions that came out of the model, it didn't impact their business too drastically. But if nothing else, all this served was as a highlight that more complicated wasn't necessarily helping them, that their business rules were the things that were actually driving their decisions, and the complicated mess that was going on in the background, even when it wasn't working right, it still was bounded by their original business rules. Sometimes easy is a much better solution than complicated. But unfortunately, a lot of times we like solving complicated problems without always thinking that the easy problem might be the solution. The next part goes into the idea of listening and asking questions. For this, I'm going to Proverbs 29:20 or Proverbs 21:23. Either one of those would serve well here. We're going to specifically talk about 21:23. Watch your tongue and keep your mouth shut, and you'll stay out of trouble. Man, that's a good one. Hits right to the heart, right? So how can everyone be on the same page? Well, the hardest part of any problem is truly understanding the results that are wanted. Do not underestimate this piece of the puzzle. You cannot be on the same page with other people without the process of communication. But communication goes both ways. You have to listen more than you need to speak. But listening takes two things to be good: desire as well as humility. You have to want to listen and then be humble enough to realize you need to listen. Lay out plans, have multiple meetings, try to define ahead of time. What does success even look like? I'll be honest with you. I have been asked multiple times if all of these meetings were really that important. If we really needed to communicate this much. I'll tell you something. I have never had success without meeting. I'm sorry. I never didn't have success with meetings, but boy, have I had a lack of success when I didn't have them. So it's one of those things. Do we over communicate sometimes? Sure. But I'd rather over communicate than under communicate. Under communication leads to assumptions, and assumptions can be wrong and things can go awry. Over communication can be just having a result of people going, you know what? I've already said this a few times. Sorry to annoy you, but at least we've got it all squared away. So now the next step in the process when it comes to understanding things, starting small. For this, let's go to the Gospels. Let's go to Matthew 25:23. The master said, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I will give you many more responsibilities." Don't try to build everything all at once. Don't try and solve all the world's problems with one foul swoop. I'm a Lord of the Rings fan, so we don't need one ring to rule them all, right? Like that's sort of the problem that we run into. Small successes that have good results can show quick value, and quick value gains momentum. Patience is a virtue. Gaining momentum can change the culture of an organization. They start thinking about data in different ways. This helps them realize that data is a tool, not a threat. There was one time I worked for an organization that was doing some basic data analysis. It was not complicated, but it was much further than they had ever gotten before. I got to help encourage them through this process. When they saw the results, they were blown away by the impact that it could have. They spent the next 2 years just going back and gathering as much data as they could. Now, 10 years later, they have had many data sources that they've built up, and now they're starting to build models and have them put in place to help guide the decisions that they made. But this all started with a few small successes. One small data set and one small problem showing how data can be valuable. Once that value was shown, it really was a snowball effect from that point going forward. Speaking of gathering data, let's talk about a data gathering mindset. Let's go to Numbers chapter 13. Now I'm going to call out specific verses, the beginning, verses 1 and 2, and the end of the story, 17 to 20. See, God is a statistician at heart. If you didn't know, the Lord now said to Moses, "Send out men to explore the land of Canaan. See what the land is like. Do your best to bring back samples of the crops you see." Right? God knew everything that was in the land, but he was trying to encourage Moses and the Israelites to go gather data. Right? Valuing data and data gathering is a mindset. We don't deal with data here. I've heard that before from Christian organizations. Really? You don't have an IT department? You don't work on a laptop? You don't have technology? You don't have a website? Do you pay someone to analyze the trends on that website? Organizations have changed with the times to better equip their employees and to better help the people they serve. Data is just another tool in the process. It allows us to be able to see some of the things that God already knows. He's helping us to be able to see the picture by gathering information. So there was one time I was talking with an organization about the data that they had and the value of it. They were collecting data by hand, literally people writing things down on paper. The people who wrote the things down on paper are not the people who ended up putting it into the computer. They would hand it off to someone else who would then type it into a computer. This process was drawn out and it was rather complicated. It led to data errors. These errors led to people who use the data to not trust that data. Now they're working with tablets out in the field, so the data is uploaded quicker and cleaner, and that has driven quicker and cleaner decisions for loan analysis. If data is going to be gathered, then IT needs to be in these conversations from the very beginning. We shouldn't just sort of think about it as an afterthought. IT is a part of most organizations, so their buy-in is imperative to the success of any new data initiative. We can come up with all the fancy models we want, but if there's no easy way to implement these models, if there's no easy way to gather data to go into these models, then let's be honest, they're useless. So that's why we need to have a data gathering mindset when it comes to understanding a problem. Last but not least, let's talk about the idea of leadership. For this, we're going to Acts chapter 6. We apostles should spend our time teaching the word of God, not running a food program. And so, brothers, select seven men who are well respected and are full of the spirit and wisdom. We will give them this responsibility. Then we apostles can spend our time in prayer and teaching the word. Data scientists, data people, data analysts, statisticians, we need the support of leadership to be successful. Empowerment, meetings, experimentation, and more importantly, room to fail. Leaders don't need to do everything. They are amazing at what they have been called to do. Luckily, so are data people. This is where data people and statisticians can help and provide value. However, we cannot provide this value if we haven't done all the things mentioned up until now. Thinking about how to solve a problem, listening and asking questions, starting small, trying to find good, quick successes, and developing a data gathering mindset. All those things allow data people to be able to help leaders do what they were called to do so that they can empower us to do what we were called to do. Any questions so far? This would be one of those stopping points that Sam was mentioning.
Yep, I've got several questions that have come in.
Love it.
The first one was back to the R story that you told about coming in and kind of they've had this R code they're using inappropriately. Why did they bring you in from outside rather than go back to whoever wrote the original R code internally and just talk to them about it?
Sure. It was one of those things. They weren't really sure if it was working right to begin with. So they weren't sure about going back to the original person who wrote it. But also at the same time, the person who wrote it sort of self-trained themselves on how to be able to do it. And so they were an analyst that did not have a lot of advanced training, but that's okay. With the help of YouTube and AI nowadays, I can do a support vector machine. Unfortunately, the downside is that they don't necessarily know all the little kinks that need to be worked out into the big system. And so they brought me in as someone who's like, hey, you have experience with this. We'd love to sort of audit ourselves and make sure things are working right. But then at the same time, it makes it so we don't have to go find the other guy again and bring him back. So that was really why they brought me in.
Good. A couple of questions about AI, since you just brought that up anyway. A couple of questions came in. How does AI change the team composition and dynamics? And are you afraid that AI is going to replace us? That they're going to say, we don't need statisticians, we can just do it with AI?
Now, just because people might say that doesn't mean they're making the right choice.
Well,
and so, for example, in our analytics program here, we use AI as a supporter as compared to a replacer. And what I mean by that is I do expect companies are going to expect higher productivity from us. But at the same time, they still need people with the knowledge to be able to understand if what the AI is giving is actually realistic or not. So, for example, I have student teams that are working on real world data projects. So it's like, all right, guys, what I'd like you to do, you guys have your insulated view of the problem. Now, you can't give AI the actual data because it's a company's data set, but you can talk in generalities with the AI and see if they can come up with other ways of thinking about solving the problem that maybe they hadn't come up with. The one downside of having a group of all statisticians, right, is we have very similar training. And if that's the case, it's very hard to be able to get a different perspective. I see AI as being able to provide a different perspective, so it adds diversity to a team without replacing people. Now, are there going to be companies that make mistakes and try and replace people? Sure. But they've been doing that for a long time before AI. I remember at this point, over a decade ago, there was an organization I used to work at as a consulting firm. One of their clients, they were trying to solve workers' compensation fraud. So the old model that they were working off of was just a basic machine learning model, and they basically replaced the entire workers' compensation fraud department with the model. And they were like, we don't need any people actually checking these things. The model will decide. Well, of course, that didn't work too well when someone sued the company because they falsely got rejected for workers' compensation. And so, needless to say, the company was like, maybe we shouldn't have fired all those people. Now, the downside, and this was a state organization, I'm not going to mention the state, the pendulum swung completely in the other direction, and they're like, that's it, we knew it, math is wrong. right? And so like then they were like, we're not going to use any data to be able to answer these problems. So people have been doing this since long before AI, where they're like, oh, well, we found a shortcut, so we're going to let the shortcut solve the problem. And in reality, we all learn in the long run, right, that shortcuts aren't the way to get around an issue. We sort of just have to be able to use the tools around us to make us better.
So another question about AI that had come in was about
Mm-hmm.
training bias in AI models.
Mm-hmm.
If you're using AI models and you're using auditing, and how do we account for the training bias? And
Mm-hmm.
along with AI, but maybe a little bit more generally, how do we make sure that the things we do are useful, not just in one particular context, but especially when you're talking about working with organizations making loan decisions in other countries? How do
Sure.
we make sure that the models we're building are appropriate for a variety of contexts?
This is where I really think communication is key. Like it really, really is. And the reason I stress that, I have built banking models for companies here in North America and Europe that are traditional. We have credit agencies. This is how the world sees credit. But it's not. It's how the Western world sees credit. And I've had to talk with people in sub Saharan Africa who don't carry wallets, right? Like this is a different world we live in. And so the way they perceive things, the way they look at credit, the way they look at loans, the way, in all honesty, they look at a European descendant male coming into their country to tell them, guys, no, trust me, we know how to do this and you don't, considering they just fought for independence one generation ago, is a little bit different. And so being able to understand the problem, I think, is really what's important. If we go out to AI, you're exactly right. We are biased by the data that's being put in there. Well, who's putting that data in there? Well, the people who basically transact in data all day long. For a lot of these Christian organizations, they're working with people who have been forgotten by the world and only seen by God. And so trying to be able to understand who they are as a person goes well beyond data. And so trying to be able to understand those people is the work of a lot of these organizations. So that's why as data people, when we come in to solve their problems, we need to understand the people behind the data and not the data themselves. So hopefully that hits at both pieces, Sam, you were looking for.
Okay. Yeah. And one other question came in here. When we're
Sure.
doing the problem solving, you're talking about the communication piece, but how do we make sure that we have access to the data, that it's the right data, not just a cleaned up version of the data that they want us to see, or that they've kind of glossed over issues. So maybe it wasn't cleaned the way we would like it to be cleaned.
Oh man, I mean, those are situations where it would be great if we could sort of just tell everyone ahead of time, like the wish list, where it's like, here's exactly the data that I want. I just need you to hand it all to me, and then everything will be taken care of. I wish I could give you a magic potion that will make it so that all clients can just automatically hand in the perfect data set for you. But even a client I'm dealing with right now, right? Like now, after building models and going back and having conversations where it's like they're running the models live out there in the real world, and they're like, these results don't look the same as when you were building them. And my team and I are like, yeah, you're right, what's going on? And they're like, well, I mean, we do different loan products now than what the data is we gave you. And we're like, I mean, that would have been helpful to know ahead of time, right? And so like when we're having all these conversations and we're telling you, right, this is what you're using, and you go, yes, like that didn't spark any kind of situation. But I think if nothing else, right, no one's perfect. We're all sinners. We're all fallen short of grace, right? So we need grace. And so we try and give grace to people. That data people and leaders at these organizations are just like for-profit organizations. They don't always know what they need. And so it's something where, yeah, we could have maybe communicated it better, but in the end, fallen people talking to fallen people are going to make mistakes. And if that's the case, then all we do is we sit there and show mercy and grace and go, hey, you know what? We make some mistakes. Here's what we can do with this model. Let's try our best. And then as this new data product comes in, maybe we should start collecting data on it. We'll adjust as we go. So I wish I could tell you there was an easy answer for just like, yeah, this is how you get clients to give you everything you need without having to ever worry about it ever again. But a lot of times you may not even find that out until production comes along. And the next thing you know, well, I guess it didn't work as well as we were hoping, but we're a step closer to the final answer than we were before. And so now we can get there. That's the idea.
Good. I think that gets to all the questions we have so far. I'll keep sending them in as he keeps going, and we'll ask them at the next break.
Perfect. Sounds good. Sounds good. Awesome. So let's talk about the second piece. Let's talk about the juicy part. Let's talk about data. So for this one, let's go back to the Gospel of Matthew. So Matthew 25:15. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability. And he went on his journey. God has given us many different talents. He does this by design. Remember that, not by mistake. If this is the case, then all of us have been created to build out the fullness of the body of Christ. It is okay when leaders don't know everything and rely on the talents of people around them. However, statisticians, data scientists, we need to know this as well. We need to rely on the talents of the leaders to help guide us and to help us solve problems. So here's another story. I heard a pastor use this story one time. You might have heard it too. There was a giant flood and the water was rising. A person went in their car to help get this elderly neighbor. She said, "God will get me out of this." So the person left. The waters continued to rise. The lady was now in her second story as the waters took over the first floor. A person in a boat came by asking her to get in so that they could take her to safety. Again, she said, "God will get me out of this." So the person left. The water continued to rise. The lady was now on her roof. A helicopter flew over and dropped down a basket. The pilot yelled down to the lady to get in. And again, she said, "God will get me out of this." So the pilot flew off. The water continued to rise, and unfortunately, the lady didn't make it. When she got to heaven, she asked God why he didn't rescue her. God replied, "I sent a car, a boat, and a helicopter. What more do you want?" Right? And it's the same idea when it comes to the notion of Christian nonprofits. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, "You know what? Don't worry, God's got it. He'll work it all out." It's like, well, sometimes God's answer to prayer is the person trying to help you, right? And so data is not a burden. It's a gift. It's a tool. And just like any tool, there are some people with talents to be able to use it better than others. And so it's trying to be able to help these organizations see that instead of just sitting there and closing their eyes and being like, God's going to work out a miracle. It's like he might. Or his miracle might be the fact that out of all the people in the world that you could have bumped into on this day, you bumped into a data person. And so that's the miracle that he's given you to be able to help you. And so remembering that there are many people with many talents is going to be key to being able to how to use data. Speaking of that, and this goes back to one of the questions that was asked earlier, let's talk about subject matter experts. Specifically, let's go to Exodus 31. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom, in understanding, in knowledge, and in all kinds of craftsmanship, to create artistic designs." Subject matter experts are the lifeblood of any analytics problem. They can make the difference between success and failure in the modeling phase of a project. They're the people that tie the data problem and the solution back to implementation, regulation, deployment. They're the ones that make it all work. So that means data people, we need access to the correct subject matter experts to help us with guidance on the problem, as well as to answer specific questions that would drive results and insights. But that means leaders need to help bridge that gap for data people to make sure they are talking to the right people, to ensure that the solution that the data people provide actually works in the business as a whole. So one of the organizations I worked with was helping people in impoverished countries with microfinance loans. The subject matter experts in that company were invaluable. I hinted at this a little bit earlier. They revealed important knowledge on the cultures of the individuals for the loans. This directly impacted not only the interpretation of the variables that we were using, but whether certain variables should even be used in the model. So, for example, for the needed loans, they're collecting information about these individuals and their families that normally we would not be allowed to use here in the United States. In the United States, I cannot use your gender to be able to make a loan decision. In the United States, I can't use the fact that you have children at home to be able to make a loan decision. But that doesn't mean that it isn't known in that culture and in that bank in that country. So maybe for them, those pieces of information are key to helping them make better data-driven decisions. A lot of these organizations are trying to empower women. So in all honesty, gender matters to them. So we should include that in the model, not because it's the proper thing to do in Western banking culture with our regulations, because it's the proper thing to do for the problem they're solving in that country at that time. So the next thing, I mentioned this also in answering one of the questions earlier. See, I'm foreshadowing myself. Let's talk about no shortcuts. Let's go to Proverbs 19:2. Proverbs 21:5 is another good one for this too. Enthusiasm without knowledge is no good. Haste makes mistakes. People are always looking for the quick out when it comes to the process of data science and analytics. They really are. They expect a quick solution because they don't fully understand the complication of the problem. Methods taken by statisticians and data scientists might seem cumbersome by some people, but typically there's a method to the madness. Assumptions drive inference, and inference drives insights and decisions. So we have to be very careful that we don't interpret and analyze the data incorrectly and then end up making the wrong decision. Also, data is typically not as clean as leadership thinks it is, because you know what? They're not dealing with the data on a day-to-day basis. So that means that we must be given the leeway to experiment and, in all honesty, possibly fail when going down a path. They don't always know the results ahead of time, they being statisticians, data people. So if we don't know the results ahead of time, then we should be allowed to be able to experiment and try a few things to be able to find the right results. There are no easy shortcuts in being able to do this. There really, really aren't. Now, when you get to the end, let's talk about accuracy and interpretability for a moment. Proverbs is so good with so many things. Let's go to Proverbs 18:2. Fools have no interest in understanding. They only want to air their own opinions. Both Christian leaders and data people need to understand the balance between accuracy and interpretability. Sometimes beautiful, complicated models aren't useful. Sometimes easy to understand models don't predict as well as more complicated ones. But there is a balance. I'll be honest, statisticians can have a tendency to like the new fancy thing that they see, right? That's what we do as data people. We need to be careful sometimes of wanting to try the awesome new approach when some of the basic things might be the most helpful. Sometimes it feels like they want to make their job more exciting by building out something fancy. That's not always the solution. There was one time I was brought in to analyze a church's survey results for their deacon board. I could have tried to come up with a complicated piece of analysis. Maybe, some conditional probabilities, association analysis built in, throw in some market basket stuff. That would have been really cool. Maybe principal components analysis, try and find some underlying factors. You know what? They just needed the results. Like boring old results, bar charts was all they really needed. They didn't need anything ultra fancy. I didn't need to show how smart I was. I needed to show how I could humbly serve, right? And that was the idea that we need to sometimes balance things with, is a lot of times we can jump down the complicated approach when it may not be necessary. And then we wonder why people can't understand us, right? And so it's that same kind of balance that we have to strike. Let's end this section the same way we ended the first section. Let's talk leadership. So John chapter 3, verse 30, he must be greater and greater, and I must become less and less. Data scientists, analysts, statisticians need the support of leadership to be successful. Empowerment, meetings, experimentation, and failure. Again, leaders don't need to do everything. But that being the case, we need to be able to humbly say that we're not the most important person in the room. And that goes for both sides. Leadership, you don't need to do everything. It's okay if you become less and less and the data person becomes more and more. Statistician, you don't need to be doing everything. It's okay for you to become less and less and someone else to become more and more. If we both approach this situation humbly, I think it'll make things so much easier to be able to solve as compared to trying to each sound like the smartest person in the room. So, Sam, that's the end of another section. We only have one more section to go. I'll open it up back for questions again.
Okay, I've got a couple that came in. I just saw one come in. I'll jot that one down, summarize it while you're answering these other ones. The first question was, you keep using the term data people. So we had somebody express that was, they kind of like it, but they were wondering what you mean by that and why you use that term as opposed to something else. So who are you trying to include, and why do you seem to like that term over other ways of referring to us?
You know, it's one of those weird things. I'm going to age myself here. I remember when statisticians and statistics degrees started becoming something in schools, and I remember math people being like, "You statisticians, like you're just another version of math. Like, why do you need your own degree?" And then I remember, 2 decades ago when we started creating analytics degrees. And I remember the statisticians saying, "Oh, you analytics people, why do you even need your own degree? It's just statistics." And then data science people come along and the analytics people are like, "Oh, you data scientists, you're just analytics professionals. Why do you call yourself something different?" And so it's really just to be all encompassing. We're all data people. Whether we work with numbers, whether as a form of, collecting data, as a form of statistical analysis, as a form of computer science, data science, as a form of pure mathematics, in the end, we're all data people. And so that's why I like that term, because if I were to say someone is a data scientist, a statistician might go, "Well, that maybe not be me." Or if I say someone's an analytics professional, the math person may be like, "Well, that may not be me," and vice versa. And so it's like, you know what? We're all data people. So let's just all encompass it. So anytime you hear me throw out, that's why I'll interchange the terms. Sometimes I'll say data scientist. Sometimes I'll say analyst. Sometimes I'll say statistician. Because in reality, we're all the same. It's just a matter of we have different focuses on different aspects of problems. And that's okay.
Okay. Next question that came in was about funding sources. You talked about those shortcuts, and this person was asking about the idea of sometimes funding organizations can sort of embed shortcuts in what they're asking you to do and the funding they're offering you. How do you navigate that part of things?
Oh, man, I'll be honest with you. When I first started in the world of Christian nonprofits, a lot of what I did was pro bono. And the reason I did that is because a lot of these organizations, especially early on when they're immature, they don't know what they don't know. And so they don't have a budget to be able to really solve complicated data problems because they've never had them before. They have no notion of how long things take, of what kind of data collection they need, or anything along those lines. So in all honesty, when I first started, and most of my first projects with most organizations are just, "Hey, let's meet, let's chat, let's talk. Oh, if you want, I'll just explore your data and just sort of see what kinds of questions might even be answerable, and do a little bit of work to be able to then say, okay, here's the kinds of things I think I can answer with your data. And here's the kind of costs that it would probably take to be able to answer this." Now we have a basis and a foundation to have a conversation. But you're right, like a lot of organizations ahead of time may not know those kinds of things. And so because of it, they try to build in shortcuts into their costs because again, this is just me, it may be me being naive. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to assume they're not trying their best just to skim money off of you, and they really just don't know how much things truly do cost. And so if that's the case, then it's like, okay, well, you know what? I'm willing to be able to take a little bit of a hit on this first one to show you the value of what this can provide. And that's the big thing too, right? We have to show the actual numerical impact sometimes, where it's like, hey, I know I only charged you this much money, but look at how much money it's actually given you. So now when you see my next bill, you can understand why this is the normal amount I would charge as compared to what we worked on to start with. So in all honesty, there's a lot of sort of, if you're willing to, taking a little bit of a hit for the hope of sort of something higher later.
Okay. And you kind of mentioned this again. Somebody was asking about, it seems like you only work with Christian organizations.
Mm.
Is that
So
true? Do you turn down non-Christian organizations or organizations that maybe you think what they're trying to do isn't really in keeping with your interpretation of biblical principles?
mm. So I am extremely blessed that my work with organizations is not my primary paycheck, right? Like my primary paycheck that puts food on the table is my job at a university, which allows me to then have freedom to be able to make decisions along those lines. So I do work with some for-profit organizations, not as much as I used to. Back when I first started out in the world of academia, I'll be honest, I worked with a lot of for-profit organizations. That's what my consulting work was on the side, was working with people in those kinds of spaces. And in all honesty, being connected with, oh, this goes back before the ICS was the ICS, the CSIDG, or remember, if I remember Jason right, did I get all the letters right? So back then, I remember an email going out asking for help from a Christian nonprofit. That was well over a decade ago at this point. And that's what first got me plugged into that space. And over the last 10 plus years, God has blessed me with opening doors by just trusting and following Him. And so new organizations come up and I talk with them and I interact with them. And those are the things that form a lot more of my sort of side work now, is a lot of those organizations. So yeah, I do take the occasional contract otherwise where it's like, okay, this will be worth some time. I have a little bit of free time and flexibility. Sure, why not? But a lot of times I choose to work with just Christian organizations because, well, I have a busy job to begin with. But then also on top of that, it's like, hey, you know what? I can do this on the side and actually help and give back to the kingdom in some small way. And so, yes and yes, but with a side of yes to your question.
Okay, so there was a follow-up that I wasn't sure if I was going to ask because I didn't know how you were going to answer the first one, so I'll
No
follow up
worries.
with it. So when you do work with secular organizations or
Mm-hmm.
for-profit organizations, how do you bring in your Christian biblical worldview and
Mm.
perspectives to bear on those conversations?
So much like the same kinds of conversations we've been having around this talk so far, it's humility, servanthood, listening. It's those kinds of biblical principles that I still hold to whenever I try and solve a non Christian organization's problem. Now, of course, if the non Christian organization is coming in and they're asking me about things that I don't think already are going to be things that would follow my biblical worldview, I'm not going into that organization trying to be able to solve. But if it's just more things on the side where it's like, I can give you an example. A small financial planner office was like, hey, we're doing a couple of models on some of our analysis for some of our investments that we've done for some clients. We'd like just a third party audit. Another company came in and were like, hey, we're developing pricing for our retail products. Can you just do like an audit to make sure we're not missing anything? I'm like, okay, cool. You know what? None of the things you guys are doing seem to be in any way, shape, or form shady. And so I'm more than happy to be able to help you and work with you. If an organization came in, I'm in the middle of North Carolina. We used to be tobacco country. I'll be honest with you. If a tobacco organization, a cigarette company came and said, hey, can you help us do analysis? Personally, I wouldn't feel comfortable with that. I don't think smoking is anti-Christian, but it's one of those things where I've seen firsthand what the problem of smoking can do with my family. And so I just don't want to be able to help in that regard. And so I am allowed, with this not being my full-time job, to be able to make the kinds of decisions that I have. But I'm not afraid to share who I am with people. That's just how it is. If they don't want to hire me, that's their choice. I don't mind.
Sure. One last question, I think, at this point in
Mm-hmm.
this section. So, what collaborative skills do you think guide the idea of deference and kind of conflict resolution when you're working with a client?
Mm. First instinct is, I'm sorry, right? Like it's one of those things where even if they've obviously made a mistake, at some point then, I'm sorry I didn't ask the right questions because it's my job to help you solve your problem. And just like it's a lifeguard's job to be able to help, a struggling swimmer, it's the same idea here, right? The lifeguard's not going to get to the struggling swimmer and be like, look, your backstroke's not going well here. You would make it a lot easier on me if you just knew how to swim. It's like, well, obviously, right? And so at some point, the lifeguard has to sit there and say, look, you know what? My bad for not just helping you in this process. And so it's the same idea I feel when I go into an organization. I'll be honest with you. I've worked for for-profit organizations back when I was a full-time consultant, and it was my paycheck. There was one time when the subject matter expert we were paired with was basically, he converted the project into making his job easier, and we didn't know that. And so when we presented to the big boss was like, well, that's not how we do things as a team. That's how Larry does something. Name change to protect the innocent. But, that's how Larry may do it, but that's not how the rest of us do it. And you know what? That was on us for not double checking beyond Larry, and not just assuming, hey, you know what? I've got a person here who might just be trying to make their job easier. Maybe I should have checked with the big boss sooner, or checked with some of Larry's colleagues, or, in the end, there are things that I can do to be able to try and help out with the problem. Now, yeah, there are some things that, know what? They lied to me. Okay. You know what? There's nothing I can do on that regard. You're just being honest with them and be like, look, things have changed then. And since things have changed, these results may not be as accurate as you were hoping for because the information I was provided wasn't fully accurate. But again, you approach it humbly and as a servant. And that's sort of the idea. Jesus wasn't afraid to call out sinners, but he also asked them to repent. It's the same idea here, right? It's like, hey, look, you made some mistakes. That's all right. I'm still willing to help you. I'm not going to just walk away from it just because you don't know fully what you're doing.
Okay, yeah. A quick question came up following up about Larry. So
sure.
I'll get that in here while we're still talking about it. So
no
do you
worries.
have any tips on how do you ask the right kinds of questions or whatever to make sure you're ferreting out those unknowns like self-interest from the one person you've talked to in the early stage of working with an organization to make sure that you're aware that like Larry's been known to try to hijack things. So check on that.
No, you're exactly right. I think for us, when we were talking about it as sort of like a retrospect, the thing we should have done was double checking processes. So it's like, hey, Larry, how do you solve this problem? Awesome, great. So when you solve this problem this way, how do you hand it off to insert other person's name here? Let's go Tina. And how does Tina then take it and solve this problem? And then if Larry goes, you know what, I really don't know what Tina does when she does that. That's okay. You know what? We'll figure it out from Tina. And so it's trying to be able to get both sides of it, right? And so a lot of times it's sitting down with the people who are going to be using it in the end. And that's what we didn't do. We trusted Larry to tell us how other people use the solution. In reality, I should have gone straight to the person who uses the solution and figured out, all right, look, Larry tells me you guys do it this way. And then they would have been like, oh, goodness, no. Larry's crazy. He doesn't know anything. He's never at these meetings. So this is how we actually do it. So it really is trying to go down to the most basic level. Who is actually going to look at the results from what you have created and figure out how they use it and they implement it? Just like middle management, right? The more layers there are in between, the harder it is to find out the truth. It's like those old games of telephone we used to play as kids. And so trying to eliminate the middle person in terms of the telephone. That's my best advice.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Then let's jump into the last section. Let's talk about impact. So Colossians 3:17 on this one. And whatever you do or say, do it as a representative of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father. Impact is a common goal that binds the Christian leader as well as the data scientist, statistician, analyst, data person. It is something that we can come together on. Keeping this impact in mind will help everyone in the process of trying to drive this impact. Leaders need to understand data people are trying to help measure their impact. Data people need to understand that leaders are trying to help them look past the data to see the impact on a deeper level. All of us can work together to accomplish this goal. Now, that being said, sometimes we focus on impact for our own glory, to show others how good we are as people. We need to make sure that we have the correct perspective on everything that we do. We do everything through Christ. We are thankful for the many talents, resources, and time provided to us from him. So again, another story. Nothing excites a group of students more when I tell them about the work I've done to try and help drive economic change in developing countries, right? Like student groups love me coming in and talking about those things. However, they don't get nearly as excited when I tell them I also help people sell more laundry detergent, right? But that's a perspective problem. That's a pride problem. When helping that company sell more laundry detergent, I was helping keep their lowest paid employees, the ones at the plants making labels and packaging the detergent for shipping. I was helping them keep their jobs. I was helping provide people with a means to put food on their table. All too often, if something doesn't sound exciting, people think it's not impactful. That's just not true. The impact we create is meaningful in whatever we do because we do it through Christ. I heard a preacher say this one time. Although there are many amazing people we read about in the Bible, when we get to heaven, there's going to be a lot of small church pastors that we're going to meet there that had some amazing impact. But it may not have sounded like the sexy thing to do because they weren't out in front of everybody. Just because it doesn't sound ultra exciting doesn't mean you can't make impact. But to do that, we have to have the right mindset. So let's talk about stories, or maybe it's data, or maybe it's both. So Hebrews 13:16 on this one. Don't forget to do good and to share with those in need. These are the sacrifices that please God. I'll be honest, one thing I've seen be a sticking point between data people and Christian leaders is how to evaluate results. A lot of times we see how Christian organizations talk a lot about stories to display impact. They aren't alone, right? Stories appeal to people. It helps them connect. Look at most commercials out there. Most of them are not data-driven, they're story-driven. However, those same companies don't limit themselves to stories when they measure impact. They measure impact numerically a lot of times on a larger scale. Then they pick a story from those successes to talk about. You know what? As data people, we should learn from this too. We need to learn how to speak with our clients better. If they're used to hearing stories, we need to include stories as well. I know that data people think that data should say everything, but let me show you the impact a story can make. I'm going to tell you a story from one of the projects I've worked on recently. I'm going to tell you about Phoebe. Now, it's been a struggle, but Phoebe sits proudly in her 3x3 meter tailoring shop in a busy market in Kariobangi, northeast Nairobi. Every day she wakes up at 5 a.m., she prays, has her breakfast, and heads to work. By 6:30, her shop is open, and she begins sewing garments. Phoebe's small business is her livelihood. It helps her to feed her 6 children and 3 grandchildren. There was a time when Phoebe didn't have enough money for slippers. Whatever she earned went to food and rent. There was no more left. Now she can buy food, pay rent, has sent her children to school, and even has a little money left over to save. You see, Phoebe's husband died many years ago. At the time, her eldest child was 17 and her youngest was just 5. At first, Phoebe began to make clothes on her own, but she was unable to grow her business because no one would even lend her $10. Her work was in demand, but she didn't have the means to grow. That's when Phoebe heard about a microfinance institution in Kenya and took out a loan for $100. She bought a sewing machine, fabric, and thread. Even before they asked for the money back, she paid back her loan. And now, 6 years later, Phoebe bought the little shop where she works, and she rents out another space in the market. Phoebe has since taken out 9 loans, her latest being for $400. Phoebe employs 3 other people to help her make clothes. You see, it's clear Phoebe was born to be a businesswoman. She says owning her own business makes her free. You could offer her $1 million to work for someone else, but she would still prefer her own business. Phoebe is happy to know that through her business, she has given all that she can to her children. All her children have been to school, and that means they can get a job. Phoebe's vision is to teach young people how to make clothes, then buy her own house and live a comfortable life. Stories drive impact. I could tell you all the math behind the model that lent Phoebe the loan. There are success metrics in the background that we can prove that things worked, but the story was still important. And so stories and data can both be used to be able to help us present our results. Speaking of results, let's talk about deploying our models. Ecclesiastes chapter 4 for this one. 2 people are better off than one, for they can help each other succeed. If one person falls, the other can reach out and help. But someone who falls alone is in real trouble. Model deployment is critical to success of any analytics project. That's why we bring in IT from the beginning. They are the ones who know how to best fit the results into the current system, that they need to help make sure that things work as expected. Recently, I worked with an organization and their IT team was amazing. I could ask for any data and they would provide it to me within a week. We made sure to have an IT team member on the call whenever we talked about the results with leadership. That way, we wouldn't surprise them with anything. And they could ask questions directly in the meeting about how we were going to try and implement this. They felt valued, they felt useful, which in all honesty made the process go much which made things more efficient. But let's talk about efficiency real quick. Luke 14 for this one. But don't begin until you count the cost. For who would begin construction of a building without first calculating the cost to see if there's enough money to finish it? We are commanded to be good stewards. Everything that we have is God's, which means we should be prudent with it. It would not serve us well to be flippant with the resources that belong to God that we are just borrowing here in this world. That goes for both leaders as well as data people. Leaders should not be afraid to be efficient. With saved resources, we can invest them back into our employees or into other projects to impact more people. Data people need to realize that their data, though, represents a person. This will help focus in our combined efforts to run organizations more efficiently. I'll be honest, people have this inherent fear that efficiency means firing people, but it doesn't have to. A recent organization I worked with wanted to use the results from our model to make loan decisions for microfinance loans faster. Great. However, we stressed to them that making decisions faster shouldn't mean less overhead, fewer loan officers. What this allowed the loan officers to do was to take more time on the loans that actually needed more attention. So we helped design a system so that the models could make the really easy loan decisions, the easy yeses, the easy nos, and that removed about 30 to 40% of the loans on the plate of these loan officers. That allowed these loan officers to spend more time on the tougher loans, the ones that needed a personal touch. They didn't have time for these before and made a lot of rushed decisions, but now they could do their jobs better. Again, efficiency doesn't mean firing people. It just means that people can use their time better. And that's the idea of what we can create with data at these organizations, with the whole goal being to change the culture. Let's go to Romans chapter 12. Just as our bodies have many parts and each part has a special function, so it is with Christ's body. We are many parts of one body and we all belong to each other. Buy-in is best achieved from communication and success. As people see victory in their process and no longer feel threatened, then they will buy in and support the process. However, successes won't always be the case, right? Sometimes failures will occur, but commitment to the process will help drive change, and change will help make the culture of the organization better. A culture of experimentation and support leads to greater findings and drives even further changes. So the goals of the process: let business leaders in the organization select and drive projects. It's their projects. Let them select them. Since it's their idea, they're going to have more buy-in that way. Include all the major players early and often in this situation. The more visible and the more support we have, the better the process will be in pushing change. All of this excitement, though, can lead to a lot of good ideas. But again, that's why we establish initiatives and goals. Establish them early so that it can help keep people focused and the ship doesn't just start swaying all over the ocean. Stay the course. You have your goals. You have all the major players in the game. Now you can lead change. But it will take patience. All right, Sam, that's the end of that section. It's not much more of a wrap up. It's really just we need to make sure that we realize as data people that data can help us bridge that understanding and that impact. But to do that, we need to make sure we're doing it humbly. And so that's sort of the last wrap up message. Thank you all so much. Happy to continue taking any other questions you guys have.
So actually, I don't have any questions for this section at this point.
Ooh,
I did have a couple of people. One person said thank you as they were leaving because they had somewhere else to be. They had an exam to give. Understandable, of course.
I understand. I'm sure the students wouldn't mind if they were a little late, but I get it.
Well, unless they have to do the same amount of work in less time, then students might get a little antsy about it. But otherwise, a couple of thank yous. I want to say thank you as well, Aric, for joining us, for sharing, giving us insights into your thought process. I think it was very helpful to kind of think holistically about this from somebody who's doing some of this work with nonprofits as well as for-profit organizations and kind of highlighting those differences in perspective and how we can work with these organizations. And I appreciate it. If there's
thank you. It's a pleasure being here as always.
Yeah, I don't see anything else coming in. So I guess we'll say thank you. Thanks to those of you who attended. This has been recorded. A link will be shared on the ICS website, Stats for Christ. And we will be eager, I think, in a couple of months. We're hoping maybe to set something up with Jason to have him share with us as well.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
So keep out looking at the space, looking out for announcements in the ICS newsletter and such, and we'll be sure to be back in touch. Thank you all.
Thank you all again. Take care. God bless.